All right. Hello, sports fans. Welcome to another episode of The Handy Philosopher. We're going to be looking at the last section of the smart reading today. And just look at that gorgeous man on the screen there. So cute. But anyway, um, this last section looks at objections 5, 6, and 7, and then sort of the conclusion of smart's reading. If you haven't, there's part 1 and 2 already posted, so make sure you check those out. Part 1 has got Smart's thesis, which is that sensations are brain processes. This is sort of the big thing. And by brain processes, he means the electrochemical activity of the brain. Okay, that is what sensation is. It's not what it feels like, it's not how we experience it, but it is actually what it is. Okay. Um, Recording 2 has got the first few objections that Smart looks at. You can have a look through those. But this one, we're going to be starting from objection number 5. So pens and highlighters at the ready, and here we go. Objection 5. It would make sense to say of a molecular movement in the brain that it is swift or slow, straight or circular, but it makes no sense to say this of the experience of seeing something yellow. So really what this is saying is that this is sort of linked to the idea of qualia, that raw sensation of experience, as David Chalmers would call it. When we see color, we don't see it as, oh, this is a certain wavelength. We experience it differently. It's got a qualitative difference within our brain, and so this then implies that these are two different things. We wouldn't talk about a molecule moving in the same way that we talk about smelling a flower. So this is the objection that Smart's bringing up here. As I said, it's linked to sort of the modern day argument of qualia, but we'll see Smart's reply now. Reply. So far, we have not given sense to talk of experiences as swift or slow, straight or circular. But I am not claiming that experience and brain process mean the same, or even that they have the same logic. Somebody and the doctor do not have the same logic, but this does not lead us to suppose that talking about somebody telephoning is talking about somebody over and above, say, the doctor. The ordinary man, when he reports an experience, is reporting that something is going on, but he leaves it open as to what sort of thing is going on, whether in a material solid medium, or perhaps in some sort of gaseous medium, or even perhaps in some sort of non-spatial medium, if this makes sense. So just to pause for a moment, the doctor thing, this is a little bit, if I said, oh, somebody told me that, I need to lower my cholesterol. Okay. The doctor told me I need to lower my cholesterol. There's a significantly different meaning in both of those, or not so much meaning, but connotation that comes along with both of those. Somebody told me to do this, and your initial reaction might be, well, so if someone told you to jump off a bridge, would you do it? That sort of classic idea. But when I say, well, a doctor told me to do this, now there's some context that's been added to that gives it the advice a little bit more authority. Now, what Smart is pointing out here is that somebody could have been the doctor all along. Like I could say, somebody told me to lower my cholesterol. In my head, I might be going, yeah, that somebody was a doctor. But if I don't say that, then you would never know. And you might be thinking, well, why are you listening to advice from some random? So just because we use different language for things doesn't necessarily mean that those are two separate things. Somebody could be the doctor. It's just two different ways to possibly express the same thing. And because we're using different language, it creates a different meaning in our mind. And so this, what Smart is sort of talking about is almost like the laziness of our mind. Our brain processes so much information that anything that it feels like it's familiar, anything that it feels like is familiar, it glosses over very quickly because it wants to spend more time processing the stuff that's new. Um, and so if I were to say, oh, well, somebody told me to lower my cholesterol, your brain's going to be going, oh, somebody, that's just some random. Okay, because that's how we usually use somebody. Oh, I remember someone saying blah, 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 blah. Like, that's how we generally use it. But it doesn't have to be that. Uh, it's not necessary that somebody and the doctor are two different people. Somebody could have been the doctor. Okay, the expression could just be used differently. The second part of what Smart has said here, the ordinary man, when he reports an experience, is reporting that something is going on. Um, what Smart is pointing out here is something that will become more important when we look at the conclusion part, and that's the idea that the evidence that we've got actually fits with both dualism and materialism. Okay, and Smart says this very clearly, and once we get to the end of this recording, you'll see it in the conclusion. He's he's not saying that dualism is being disproven. Um, the evidence that we have fits with both accounts. Okay, so could the experience of seeing, for example, color, um, could the experience of that be uh, in a material solid medium? So, for example, could that experience be coming from brain processes? Well, yes, it could. And there's some evidence to suggest that it is. When you're looking at color, then there's certain activity that's going on in your brain. So this would suggest that there's, some sort of causal link between those two. Um, but Smart says, or perhaps in some sort of gaseous medium, or so he's talking about, well, maybe it's not in the solid brain. Maybe it's sort of an ether or air kind of idea, which the ancient Greeks used to talk about a little bit. Um, or even perhaps in some sort of non-spatial medium, if this makes sense. When he's talking about non-spatial, remember, spatial is just a different word for like physical space. Um, and so, in some sort of non-physical medium, so the mind or the soul, could it be this? Well, it could be. It could be any of those things. Okay, each of those explanations would fit with the evidence that we have, that we're getting. Um, and so he's not saying that dualism is being proven wrong. He's simply saying that materialism fits perfectly with the evidence. And it's a heck of a lot simpler than dualism is. So why don't we just accept that? I'll continue with the reading. All that I am saying is that experience and brain process may in fact refer to the same thing. And if so, we may easily adopt a convention which is not a change in our present rules for the use of experience words, but an addition to them, whereby it would make sense to talk of an experience in terms appropriate to physical processes. So this objection is really, once again, Smart saying, well, this is really to do with language and the imperfect way that language allows us to communicate. Um, as I showed with the somebody versus the doctor idea, there's all of these connotations and hidden meanings in words that we use. When we use certain words, it sort of sets off our brain in a certain way so that we associate a meaning to that. Now, this can quite often lead to us saying things that we don't necessarily mean, or us not being able to fully express ourselves clearly. What Smart is saying here is, yes, we don't talk about the experience of, for example, seeing color as being swift or straight or circular. Okay. But that doesn't mean that we can't start to. Now, this might sound a little bit weird, but we could one day get to the point where we look at, a color, and instead of saying, oh, it's a really deep or a really vivid yellow, we there's no reason why we couldn't get to the point of saying, oh, the yellow, uh, that yellow has a really, a tight light wave configuration. This sounds weird to our ears, but it's not contradictory. It's just not the way that we talk about color now. All right. There's no reason that one day we couldn't transition to talking about experience in the same way that we talk about physical movements. So it sounds a bit weird, but Smart is just pointing out that, well, really, this is an argument that the convention of language that we use at the moment implies that there's something else going on. But conventions of language can change, and they do change regularly. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, next one. Objection number 6. Again, this is the real qualia argument. It's also linked to what's called the privileged access argument. So privileged access, exactly what it sounds like. To get to it, only a very select group have access to it. When we're talking about this with the materialism dualism account, the contents of your mind in terms of your consciousness, this is seen to be privileged access. Not just anyone can access your mind. Only you can, actually. And your brain processors do not have privileged access. Anyone with a scalpel and a bone saw can get to your brain. Okay. So this is one of the big arguments for the fact that our consciousness must be something different to just brain processes, because anyone can access our brain processes, but no one can access our consciousness apart from us. So let's have a look. Objection 6. Sensations are private. Brain processes are public. If I sincerely say I see a yellowish orange after image, and I am not making a verbal mistake, then I cannot be wrong. But I can be wrong about a brain process. The scientist looking into my brain might be having an illusion. Moreover, it makes sense to say that 2 or more people are observing the same brain process, but not that 2 or more people are reporting the same inner experience. Okay, so this is going to sound super cheesy, fair warning, but it's a little bit like trying to explain what love feels like. It's ineffable. It's unexplainable. Okay. This objection is saying, if I asked you to explain an experience that you're having, okay, tell me about that color yellow. Well, it's not like that. Like, tell me about why your favorite song is your favorite song. It's probably there's going to be an element to it that's like, it's just sort of the feeling of it. Okay, and so we wouldn't say this about brain processes though. Okay, if I'm looking at a brain scan and I'm looking at the activity of the brain, it is what it is. There's no difficulty in explaining what I'm seeing, as long as I know how to read those sorts of things correctly, obviously. But in theory, anyone who looks at it and knows what they're doing would say the same thing. But this is not true of sensory experiences. Okay, so Smart's reply here, very short to what I see as probably the best objection to materialism. This shows that the language of introspective reports has a different logic from the language of material processes. It is obvious that until the brain process theory is much improved and widely accepted, there will be no criteria for saying Smith has an experience of such and such a sort, except Smith's introspective reports. So we have adopted a rule of language that normally what Smith says goes. So look, Smart's reply here he's once again sort of saying that, well, there's two problems with replying to this objection. Firstly, we're in the habit of really just saying that um, people have ultimate authority over reporting their conscious experiences. No one else is more of an authority on your consciousness than you. And this is like a habit, or this is the norm that we have built in. Um, but this does not necessarily always need to be the case, is what Smart is saying. What might change that is the other problem that Smart has with replying to this objection, which is that the brain process theory needs a lot more research. Um, he's offering this theory not in its sort of like completed form. Remember, this paper was written a fair while ago. And so what what he's really talking about here, brain science wasn't in its infancy, but it was certainly nowhere near as developed as it is today, and arguably we still can't do the things that this objection is asking us to do today with all of our advanced understanding of brain activity. So Smart here is, sort of saying we need two things to happen for this problem to be resolved. First, we need to uh, understand that language, once again, comes with all of this, meaning attached to it. And just because in the past we've allowed for the person who is having the experience to be the authority on reporting that experience, doesn't mean that it has to remain that way in the future. Second, we need a lot more research done into brain process theory so that we can better explain someone's experience from an external point of view. So if I see certain neurons firing, it may get to a point where our understanding of the brain is so precise that I can actually say, I can report, maybe what someone is feeling. Like I said right at the start, that feeling of love. It may get to a point where I can actually look at someone's brain and say exactly what they're feeling. Now, this, I think of all of the objections and replies, this is probably the weakest one that Smart gives. This is not to say that it's weak, it's a good reply, but I feel like it's got the most room for criticism or rebuttal from the dualist camp, because I think, and David Chalmers is always a good one to look at for this sort of reply, because this really comes down to the easy versus the hard problem. And, again, jump on YouTube and type in David Chalmers easy versus hard problem. You'll get a million videos of him talking about it. But in essence, he sees the easy problem being that one day we will develop the technological ability to be able to scan and analyze brain activity right down to the molecular level. Now, this is still a long way off. As advanced as our science has become, this is a fair way off still. But this, Chalmers says, is the easy problem. Let's imagine another 100 years, maybe another 1,000 years of uninterrupted technological advancement. It's perfectly logical, or it's perfectly foreseeable that we may get to the point where we have a molecular knowledge of the brain. We know what absolutely every molecule in the brain does, and we can actually read that from the outside using some sort of scanning mechanism. Okay, this for Chalmers is the easy problem, explaining the activity of the brain. The hard problem for Chalmers is still explaining the qualia of it. Okay, just because I can look at your brain scan and say, oh, this person is thinking about love, I still don't know how that person is actually feeling. I might even be able to look at their brain and say, oh, it's a bittersweet memory. Okay, but I still don't know what that feels like for that person. This for Chalmers is the hard problem. And I don't think that Smart has given a good enough reply to the hard problem side. He's sort of saying that once we solve the easy problem, that also solves the hard problem. I'm not sure that that's the case. I think that this is a good objection to sort of drill into a little bit and say, well, maybe Smart hasn't dealt with the full implications of what experience is. Because no matter how good a map is, it's different to the destination. I might be able to create a perfect map of something, but it be different it's still not the same as the thing itself. Okay. Um, I might be able to perfectly map the brain to read experiences, but that is not the same as living the experiences. The easy versus the hard problem. Okay. Check out Chalmers. He says it a lot better than I do. And he's a total rock star. So, but um, objection number 7. So we can imagine that we have no brain processes. So we can imagine, for example, that we're made of stone, but we could still have conscious experience or sensations. This is probably one of the dumbest objections that we get, but let's run through it quickly. As you can see, the objection is one line. I can imagine myself turned to stone and yet having images, aches, pains, and so on. Smart replies, I can imagine that the electrical theory of lightning is false, that lightning is some sort of purely optical phenomenon. I can imagine that lightning is not an electrical discharge. I can imagine that the evening star is not the morning star, but it is. All the objection shows is that experience and brain process do not have the same meaning. It does not show that experience is not, in fact, a brain process. So this objection is like it borders on silly, um, but it like there's something to it in that if I can conceive of a stone, for example, having sensations. So a stone, say, feeling temperature, a stone experiencing heat or cold. Um, this seems odd, but it's not necessarily contradictory. And you could sit there and say, well, how do you know that they don't? How do we know that stones don't experience temperature? It could just be that they have no way to report it to us. Um, we're so used to the idea of organisms communicating with us the way that we're used to that we don't think that anything else possibly can. Maybe they do. It's like I can imagine a world where stones feel temperature. Um, but I mean, we'll see in the start of Smart's reply here is basically, well, I can imagine a lot of things. Doesn't make it right. And he talks about a few of the things that he's brought up previously. So, the explanation of lightning as being an electrical a discharge rather. I can imagine that that's wrong. It doesn't make it wrong. I can imagine that lightning is, well, let's think historically, the Vikings believed that lightning was, Thor. That's what they imagined. That's how they explained thunder and lightning. That didn't make it right just because they imagined that. Lightning has always been electrical discharge, whether we have known it or not. Okay, so just because we imagine something doesn't make it correct or even make it possible necessarily. Okay, uh, let's continue. This objection is perhaps much the same as one which can be summed up by the slogan, what can be composed of nothing cannot be composed of anything. The argument goes as follows. On the brain process thesis, the identity between the brain process and the experience is a contingent one. So it is logically possible that there should be no brain process and no process of any other sort either. So no heart process, no kidney process, no liver process. There would be the experience, but no corresponding physiological process with which we might be able to identify it empirically. So yeah, this is sort of repeating what I've said already, that um, this objection is trying to separate the experience from the brain process. So could we imagine that occurring without, could we imagine the experience occurring without the brain process? Yeah, well, yes, this seems ludicrous to us, but as you'll see in just a moment, it's the cornerstone of dualism that experience can exist without brain processes, or any physical processes. So we'll see that in just a moment. I suspect that the objector is thinking of the experience as a ghostly entity. So it is composed of something, not of nothing after all. On his view, it is composed of, let's say, ghost stuff, and on mine, it is composed of brain stuff. Perhaps the counter reply will be that the experience is simple and uncompounded, and so it is not composed of anything at all. After all, sorry. This seems to be a quibble, for if it were taken seriously, the remark, what can be composed of nothing cannot be composed of anything, could be recast as an a priori argument against Democritus and atomism, and for Descartes and infinite divisibility. So Smart's talking about a couple of different things here. We don't need to go into too much detail. Democritus was really the first person to suggest the atomic theory, which is that the entire world, well, everything, the entire universe is made up of atoms, and that um, these are the building blocks. Okay, so an atom is kind of like a piece of Lego. Um, it will just get used and used and used and used and used. At the moment, there's a whole bunch of atoms that have been stacked together in a certain way to create you. One day, that will fall apart. In other words, one day you will die, but your atoms will not. They will break apart again and then be used to build something new. Okay, and so Democritus is, from the ancient Greek, from ancient Greece, one of the first people to suggest the atomic theory of matter. Okay, um, Descartes and infinite divisibility. Um, this is the idea. Infinite divisibility is the idea that something is able to be divided infinitely. Okay. Um, this is usually seen to be a weakness in Descartes' argument, okay, that things can be divided infinitely. But this sort of argument seems to be arguing against Democritus and for Descartes. Okay, so we'll continue on. It might become clearer as we go. And it seems odd that a question of this sort could be settled a priori. So remember, a priori just means through logic alone. So it seems odd that a question about our physical world could be settled um, through logic. Surely the best way to answer a question about our physical world is through empiricism. In other words, a posteriori understanding, knowledge gained through the experience of our physical world, or basically through scientific exploration. Isn't that the best way to determine how our universe is structured? We must therefore construe the word composed in a very weak sense, which would allow us to say that even an indivisible atom is composed of something, namely itself. Now, we've now split the atom, and we now know that there are subatomic particles. So this has thrown a bit of a spanner in the works for this reply, because it was once believed that the atom was the smallest object in the universe. It couldn't be, like, that was it. It couldn't be divided. We've now divided the atom into its constituent parts, and who knows, we might be able to divide those parts too. Maybe infinite divisibility is possible. We divide and divide and divide and divide and divide forever. It's like, cutting up something where you can cut it in half and then a quarter and then eighths and then sixteenths and then 32s, etc., 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 etc. Will you ever actually stop? Well, maybe not. Maybe you'll be able to divide it forever. Okay. Um, But we'll continue on anyway. The dualist cannot really say that an experience can be composed of nothing, for he holds that experiences are something over and above material processes. Now, this is really important. The dualists are not arguing this point of view, that there's nothing and then there's experiences. Okay. What they're arguing is that, okay, it's not brain processes and experiences, but it's something else and experiences. So it's a soul and experiences, or it's a mind and experiences. Okay. They're not arguing nothing. That is, that they uh, are a sort of ghost stuff, or perhaps ripples in an underlying ghost stuff. I say that the dualist's hypothesis is a perfectly intelligible one. So, as I said before, Smart is not objecting to the dualist. Well, he's not trying to disprove dualism. As he says here, the dualist hypothesis is a perfectly intelligible one. It makes sense. The question that Smart is encouraging us to ask is it the best answer though? So this is leading to the Occam's razor idea that we should be accepting arguments that are simpler over arguments that are more complex. But I say that experiences are not to be identified with ghost stuff, but with brain stuff. This is another hypothesis, and in my view, a very plausible one. The present argument cannot knock it down a priori. So we can't use logic alone to say that experiences are not the same thing as brain processes. That's what Smart has really finished up saying here. We can't use logic alone to say that experiences are not brain processes. Now, the reason for that is because the same logic we would be able to use to say, well, experiences are not mind processes either, or not soul processes or ghost processes. Okay, so it would actually destroy all the arguments, not just the materialist one. So it's sort of we're either both possibly right or both definitely wrong. Which one do you want to be? Okay, Smart is saying dualism could be right. It's just a inelegant answer to the question. Okay, this will become very clear in the conclusion that Smart's about to give. Okay, because we'll have a look at this Occam's razor argument that he's using. I've got it in standard form at the end of the slide, so if you're having trouble with it, just hold on. It might become a lot clearer soon. So continuing on, go over the page to the conclusion. I've now considered a number of objections to the brain process theory. I wish now to conclude by some remarks on the logical status of the thesis itself. U.T. Place, this is another author, seems to hold that it is a straight-out scientific hypothesis. If so, he is partly right and partly wrong. If the issue is between, say, a brain process thesis and a heart thesis or a liver thesis or a kidney thesis, then the issue is a purely empirical one, and the verdict is overwhelmingly in favor of the brain. So this UT Place has made the comment that this problem that we're talking about is a purely scientific one. Or sorry, not the problem, the hypothesis is a purely scientific one. Okay, the brain process hypothesis. Well, it depends. If it's the brain versus other parts of the body that people used to associate with experience. So, this is why the heart is associated with love. Perhaps the heart is where our experiences are. Well, maybe, or the liver or the kidney, maybe it's these body parts, maybe it's the, interaction of these body parts. But this seems, if that's the question, then surely we have enough evidence to say that, no, it's the brain. Okay, can I say this with absolute certainty? No, but if I was looking for where a thought was happening, I'd be looking at the brain first before I look at the kidney. Okay, I'd be looking for evidence of that thought in your brain before I look for evidence of it in your kidney. Okay, the right sort of things don't go on in the heart, liver, or kidney, nor do these organs possess the right sort of complexity of structure. On the other hand, if so, this is sort of the first idea. Um, if it's just between different physical things, then the debate is really over. It's the brain. If it's a physical thing, then it's the brain. It's not the heart, it's not the kidney, etc., etc. Um, the next part is really the more complex um, uh, interpretation of this idea of the hypothesis is a purely scientific one. On the other hand, if the issue is between a brain or heart or liver or kidney thesis, that is, some form of materialism, on the one hand, and epiphenomenalism on the other hand, then the issue is not an empirical one. So epiphenomenalism is uh, I mean, it sort of encompasses lots of different things, but for our purposes, we're really talking about the dualist argument that there is this something else that's interacting with our physical body. Okay, the non-physical soul or mind. There's some sort of phenomenon beyond measurement. Okay, epiphenomenalism. Uh, so we can interpret that for our purposes as the dualist argument. Okay, then this is not, Smart is saying, a empirical um, uh, this is not an empirical hypothesis then, because I can't measure something that's epiphenomenal. Okay, it's like me asking you to break out a ruler and measure the you know how wide your soul is. Well, what? So exactly, this is a non-empirical. I can't actually study it. For there is no conceivable experiment which could decide between materialism and epiphenomenalism. So this is an important point. Remember, we can sort of transfer dualism for epiphenomenalism here, and this would then change this sentence to, for there is no conceivable experiment. There's no experiment that I can possibly imagine which could decide between materialism and dualism. There is zero experiment that I could run that would prove one over the other. This is what Smart is saying. And the vast majority of philosophers on both sides would actually agree with this. Okay, this latter issue is not like the average straight-out empirical issue in science, but like the issue between the 19th century English naturalist Philip Goss and the orthodox geologists and paleontologists of his day. According to Goss, the Earth was created about 4000 BC, exactly as described in Genesis, with twisted rock strata, evidence of erosion, and so forth, and all sorts of fossils, all in their appropriate strata, just as if the usual evolutionist story had been true. So for those of you who don't know, this is commonly referred to as the young Earth theory now. It's still around, believe it or not. There's still people who firmly believe this. So this is not some relic of the past. There's plenty of people who think that the Earth is only a handful of thousands of years old, as opposed to the literal billions of years old that it is. And what we're going to see here is Smart using this as an example of a similar problem, but as we see between materialism and dualism. Okay, it's the young Earth theory versus the old Earth theory. Okay, so according to the young Earth theory, I'll put it into a very quick nutshell here. According to the young Earth theory, about 4,000 years ago, give or take, as is explained in Genesis, God created the Earth. Okay, and God actually created the Earth. Like, imagine God snapping its fingers, and the Earth was created 4,000 years ago, but with evidence in it that suggests that it had existed for millions or billions of years. So 4,000 years ago, when God created the Earth, God created the Earth with dinosaur bones buried in the ground that made it look like there were dinosaurs that existed millions of years ago, with sediment in the rivers that suggested that water had been eroding rock over millennia, and grinding boulders down into sand. Um, God created the earth with layers of rock that suggested that there had been, volcanic layering of rock over millions and millions of years, but that those things didn't actually take place. It's just that God created the earth to make it look like that, but the earth was only actually created about 4,000 years ago. Okay. Now, this might seem silly, and it is, but this is the young earth theory that all of the evidence that we have, everything that we can point to in evolution and geology that says that the Earth is really, 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 really old, all of this was actually put in place by God at the creation of the Earth, which was actually only about 4,000 years ago. Okay, this is the theory. Okay, let's continue. Where were we? Clearly, this theory is in some sense irrefutable. In other words, we can't disprove this theory. No evidence can possibly tell against it. And this is the problem with young Earth theory, and this is why there's still young Earthers around, because there's actually no evidence that I can use to disprove this theory. Okay, if I dig up a dinosaur bone and I do like carbon dating on things, and I can say, look at this thing, that is 65 million years old, then a young earther can simply reply with, no, God put it there 4,000 years ago and made it look like it was 65 million years old, but it's actually only 4,000 years old, because that's how old the earth is, so it can't possibly be any older. But God makes it look like it's 65 million years old. Okay, so this is what he means by it's irrefutable. There's no evidence that I could possibly give to a young earther to make them believe that the earth is older than 4,000 years old. None. Okay. Um, Let us ignore the theological setting in which Philip Goss's hypothesis had been placed, thus ruling out objections of a theological kind, such as, what a queer God who would go to such elaborate lengths to deceive us. This is the sort of, well, isn't God supposed to be all loving? Why is God going to so much trouble to fool us? Smart is saying, let's put that stuff aside for now. Okay, let's allow for a moment a God that would do this. That's fine. Okay, let us suppose that it is held that the universe just began 4004 BC, with the initial conditions just everywhere as they were in 4004 BC, and in particular that our own planet began with sediment in the rivers, eroded cliffs, fossils in the rocks, and so on. So what Smart is saying is, let's accept this hypothesis for a moment. Okay, the Earth was created 4,000 years ago with all of the evidence of millions of years of existence within it, but those millions of years of existence never took place. It's actually only 4,000 years old. Okay, no scientist would ever entertain this as a serious hypothesis, consistent though it is with all possible evidence. So what Smart is saying is, no real scientist would look at that theory and go, well, yeah, it's possible. Let's give this some real thought. They would look at it and go, okay, I understand that it fits with the evidence because, okay, I dig up this dinosaur bone, I go, it looks like it's 65 million years old, but that's just the way that God made it look. Well, no scientist should be accepting that. None. Okay. This hypothesis offends against the principles of parsimony and simplicity. Parsimony is, it's actually, you can Google search the definition yourself, but for our purposes, parsimony is the idea of almost like efficiency. Okay, that it's almost like thriftiness. You shouldn't waste money that you don't have, that you don't need to. You should only spend the money that you absolutely have to. So in science, parsimony is really the idea of, you should explain something in the fewest steps possible. Okay, the best answer explains things simply, not in a complex way. All right. And so this explanation it goes against principles of parsimony because it takes a lot of steps to explain this answer this way. Okay, so I will have here's how it works. The old Earth theory is that the Big Bang occurred, that sets the entire universe into motion over billions and billions of years. Gravity did its thing, it attracted things to each other, those things collided and became denser, and as they became denser, they became hotter, and this led, billions and billions of years of this has led to the Earth that we live on now. Okay, and over that time, the Earth has experienced lots of different things. For example, about 65 million years ago, we had dinosaurs walking around on the Earth. We know this because there are bones in the Earth that we can date to that time period based on the layering that they're in, so the stratum of the Earth that they're in, based on the things that they're surrounded by within that strata. This is how we know that dinosaurs existed 65 million years ago. Now, are there unanswered questions in that theory? Yes, there are. Okay, what caused the Big Bang? Well, we're not exactly sure. Okay, that's pretty much the only question at the moment that's unanswered for that theory, to be honest, but that's a pretty big question. Let's take the young Earth theory. Okay, so the Big Bang didn't happen. Evolution didn't happen. The Earth was created 4,000 years ago, just as it is. Those bones that are in the Earth were put there by God to make it look like they've been there for 65 million years, but they actually haven't been. Okay, now we're left with a lot of why. Well, why or how? Why did God put the bones there? Couldn't have God created the Earth 4,000 years ago without dinosaur bones in it? Well, yes, of course, an all-powerful God could have done those things. What benefit was there in creating the Earth with dinosaur bones in it? Absolutely none. None. None whatsoever. They serve absolutely no purpose. And so we get a lot of, well, why? Why is it like that? How did it happen like that? Um, it loses what science really values, which is explanatory power. Okay, and by that I mean um, it the young Earth theory has a significantly lower explanatory power than the old Earth theory. We can't explain things with the young Earth theory. Basically, the answer to everything is because that's the way that God made it in the young Earth theory. In the old Earth theory, why is it that humans and chimpanzees share 98% of their DNA? Well, according to the young Earth theory, because that's the way that God made them. According to the old Earth theory, because over, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years of evolution, chimpanzees and humans have got a common ancestor. Um, so we are of the same very, very, very extended family tree. This is why we are quite biologically similar. Now, we spanned apart quite a long time ago, and we broke off onto our own branch of this family tree. The chimpanzees and the great apes went along a different branch of their family tree, and this is why we are different now. But the reason that we are so similar, the reason that we share 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees is because of this evolutionary link. Okay, that thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, we were once the same thing. Okay, it explains it. You hear that and you go, oh, okay, well, that actually, yeah, that makes sense. But that's not possible in an Earth that's only 4,000 years old. Okay, it's just not possible. So we don't get any explanatory power. Let's continue on. There would be far too many brute and inexplicable facts. Why are pterodactyl bones just as they are? No explanation in terms of the evolution of pterodactyls from earlier forms of life would any longer be possible. We would have millions of facts about the world as it was in 4004 BC that just have to be accepted. So this is the explanatory power idea. Okay. So hopefully the analogy that Smart's presenting here between the young Earth and the old Earth, you're drawing connections to dualism versus materialism in your own head. Um, Materialism is being presented as the old Earth theory, that the Earth is billions of years old, and through processes of geological change and evolution, that's how we've gotten to the Earth that we've got today, and that will continue to change through those processes. Um, Whereas dualism is the young Earth theory. It's the well, that's just cause. It's that way because it's the way that it is. It doesn't really explain anything. Okay. Um, Smart in this last paragraph really lays out his argument. I've tried to put it into standard form here, just to run through it very quickly. So, the argument that we're going to see Smart presenting um, in this paragraph, I've put first, but there's an implied argument that he's referred to throughout his text that tells us the end conclusion. So that second implied argument that I've got at the bottom there, the conclusion is not implied. He straight out says that, but how he gets there is implied in this last paragraph, but has been said explicitly earlier. Okay, so just to run through it quickly, the argument we're going to see, so premise one, there's no cogent philosophical argument that forces us to accept dualism. So there's no a priori, there's no reason if we're just using logic, there's no logical reason that says we must accept dualism. Okay. Premise two, the brain process thesis and dualism are equally consistent with the facts. So there's no posteriori conclusive evidence. So in other words, there's no evidence gained through experience that says that either dualism or materialism is correct. Both of them are possible a posteriori. Both of them fit with the evidence and the experience that we have. So with both of those things, what we're left with is the brain process thesis and dualism are at least equally likely. Okay. Really what he's saying here is there's no argument that says that materialism is correct or that dualism is correct. Both of them are possible. Okay. The implied part here is that okay, so principles of simplicity. So this is the concept of Occam's razor, that we should accept the simplest argument over more complex ones, encourages us to accept simple theories over convoluted ones. The brain process thesis is far simpler than the dualist theory. Therefore, the brain process theory is to be preferred over the dualist one. Okay, so let's read this last paragraph. Sorry, this recording's gone on a bit longer than I anticipated. I know I've been ranting about things, but the issue between the brain process theory and epiphenomenalism seems to be of the above sort, assuming that a behavioristic reduction of introspective reports is not possible. If it be agreed that there are no cogent philosophical arguments which force us to accept dualism, so this is premise one on the screen, and if the brain process theory and dualism are equally consistent with the facts, premise two on the screen, then the principles of parsimony and simplicity seem to me to decide overwhelmingly in favor of the brain process theory. So this is then combining that top argument with the implied argument at the bottom there. And you see the end of that is the conclusion of the second argument on your screen. Seem to me to decide overwhelmingly in favor of the brain process theory at the bottom of the screen there. Therefore, the brain process theory is to be preferred over the dualist one. Okay. As I pointed out earlier, dualism involves a large number of irreducible psychophysical laws whereby the nomological danglers dangle. So right back to recording one or the first part of the reading, Smart talked about nomological danglers. So these are things that don't fit with any scientific categorization or theory. This is a real problem. But irreducible psychophysical laws of a queer sort that just have to be taken on trust and are just as difficult to swallow as the irreducible facts about the paleontology of the Earth, with which we are faced on Philip Goss's theory. So basically, the dualist account is just as possible, and I'm using air quotes here, possible as the young Earth theory, according to Smart. It's just as consistent as the young Earth theory, because really every piece of evidence we've got is pointing us towards materialism. Does the young Earth theory fit with that evidence? Yes, it does. And does dualism fit with all of the evidence? Yes, it does. But there's a lot of parts to both of those theories where we just have to say, well, they're just the way that they are. For the young Earth theory, why would God make the Earth to look older than it actually is when that really serves no purpose? Just cause. Okay. For dualism, why does our mind connect to our body? It just does. How does it do it? It just does. Where does the mind come from? We don't know. Where does it go after our physical death? We don't know. How does it connect to our body? We don't know. How does it interact with our body? We don't know. It just does. Okay. The evidence doesn't disprove it, but the materialist argument is far simpler. It's far more elegant. And this, according to Smart, is why we should accept it over the dualist argument. Okay. I hope you've enjoyed the Smart reading. I think it's a really good one. And yeah, you got any questions, chuck them in the comments. Otherwise, I'll see you later. Have a great day.